Welcome to Now and Next in Public Affairs, brought to you by Helio Intelligence, the home of de Havilland and Forefront. I'm Jack Talbot, and we are here to discuss the future of the public affairs profession. Today, I'm lucky enough to be joined by Martin Casey, the former Director of Communications, Public Affairs and Social Impact at Cemex. Martin, thank you for joining.
You're very welcome, Jack. I'm pleased to be here. Thank you.
Martin, we're obviously going to talk about the future of the profession. What I'm really interested in understanding before we get to that with you is, for someone that's got 25 years experience working in public affairs, both here in London and also in Brussels, what's your experience like? How has the profession evolved in that time?
I think the first thing to say, Jack, is that it now is a recognised profession. When I was first starting out, it was not so common. There were some people doing things in, supporting politicians or policymakers, but there wasn't so much of the public affairs that we sort of know, recognise and love today. It was an evolving, developing area for people to work in. And those companies that were around have evolved significantly since then and expanded. And now it's not unusual, as you say, for companies. Like I've just finished working for a company after 19 years, and lots of companies now have in-house. So when I started out, mostly people were hiring in from a consultancy, but now it's not unusual for larger companies or companies in sectors which have particular challenges, and we can perhaps look at those in a while, to have their own, not just one person, but perhaps even a team of people. And certainly when I started, I was the first in my sector that I specialised in. And now, that is normal and regular, and pretty much everybody has somebody doing some work around policy, politics, external communication, reputation management. There's no hard border here, but it's really evolved both here and in Brussels. Brussels has expanded hugely. And I think we've all sort of taken a bit out of what happens in the US on the Hill in Washington and evolved. And the fact that Politico has been over here now 10 years or so, something like that. An American brand that was well known over there is now sort of part of the staple for public affairs people in Europe.
Really interesting, the dynamic and how it shifted in 20, 25 years or so is fascinating, alongside when you combine it with changes in the world more broadly, changes in tech. Really, really interesting. Are there, in your experience, kind of any major benefits or negative sides to how the profession's evolved that you see?
Yeah, on the positive side, I think the fact that companies and sectors understand that ultimately they all have to work within a regulatory framework which is governed by law, which is governed by regulators themselves. Enforcing that is actually a step forward. And that's just sort of taken as read now, but it didn't used to be. And especially if you're working in a sector which is, let's say, a bit more technical, then you tend to find a lot of senior people don't really follow or take regard to what's evolving in terms of the broader general public or the politicians and what their focus and emphasis is, how they're viewing particular parts of the economy or parts of commerce. But now I think it's become much more normalised, and public affairs is trying to make sense of one to the other, and it's a two-way thing. Talking with politicians, policymakers, influencers, NGOs, and trying to translate that into something that people who are running companies understand, but equally those things that companies need, and trying to use that in a language that all those others in policy development and politics will understand, and trying to find out where the common ground is, mutual understanding. I think that's really evolved, and I think there's broad recognition now that you add more value when that conversation is engaged in and you can find that common ground.
It's really interesting to explore how in, say, 25 years you've gone from the profession wasn't necessarily recognised as a profession to broadly speaking, more value being seen in the profession now, and the geopolitical landscape that we all live in, let alone work in, is what it is right now. And speaking to various people, the impression I get is that public affairs leaders are under increasing pressure to tell more of a story of what they think is going to happen. And also, there seems to be, in terms of the road we're all going to go down, is it's going to be more and more volatile potentially. What are your thoughts on, I guess, what the national politics will look like in the UK, but also the geopolitical angle?
Yeah, I mean, I take your basic premise as absolutely spot on. Things have become more complex, more unpredictable. The geopolitical situation obviously is much more to the fore than it used to be. If I dare say that in the past things were rather smoother, there were bumps in the road, but they weren't overnight and huge,
Yeah.
which they can be now and have been. Trying to navigate that and understand where, as a company or as a sector, your interests lie and what your narrative is. I think trying to develop a narrative when the politics is so changeable is a real challenge. And I think that's where companies or sectors are looking to public affairs professionals to help them. One, understand what's happening. Two, where's this leading to? If I make an investment today, am I safe because I need 7-10 years to get my payback on that? Will things be still okay for me to get that return on that investment? A really difficult question to answer, of course, and becoming more difficult. But having that core narrative that you can adapt as needed to ensure that you are speaking and being understood by policy people, by politicians, by other stakeholders who have an interest in your area has never been more important, I don't think. And if you don't do it, then I think you're going to come unstuck rather quickly, and much more quickly than you used to.
That's a really good point. I think it's difficult to foresee any, I guess, a reasonable business leader looking at the geopolitical landscape, even looking at the domestic political landscape in the UK, and I guess by extension what's going on in Brussels, and not understanding that it could be a big deal for them in a certain respect here or a certain respect there. That's really interesting. One of the bits I'm interested in hearing from you on, if we go back a bit, it's clear that public affairs is arguably going to be under more demand moving forward for reasons you've articulated really well. When it comes to stakeholders, and I'm talking here kind of internal stakeholders as well as external stakeholders, both here in the UK as well as Brussels, how has interaction with them changed or evolved over time? Because we hear stories, and I speak to people quite a lot, and they say, well, we used to send letters to MPs, and then you hear the WhatsApp stories, and you hear, well, people are on WhatsApp groups with this bad or that's bad. I'm really interested to understand, I guess, how it's evolved from your experience.
Yeah, well, in the old days, you actually used to write letters, and if they were really important people, you did them by hand. Those days have long passed. Although sometimes things come full circle, and if you want to differentiate yourself, sometimes a proper personal approach with a signed letter can cut through in a way that your WhatsApp or your email perhaps does not. It's quite interesting. But I think the approach has not changed in that half of the challenge has always been the internal audience and trying to ensure that your colleagues understand, one, why you're there, and two, what you do and why it's important. So when it becomes down to a public affairs professional, I'd say half the job is actually an internal one. And then as a public affairs professional, if you don't understand to a fairly deep degree about what your company does, how it does it, what it means, what impacts it has, the whole influence that it can have in doing what it does, if you don't really have a feel and understanding in some detail about that, then how are you going to be able to translate that into something that can be understood by external stakeholders, whether they are politicians, regulators, policy influencers, the neighbours in the communities around where you operate, for instance. So you have to have that real internal understanding of what you're doing. And similarly, they're the audience that you're translating what the policy makers or the politicians or the communities are saying to you. and trying to, like I say, in many ways you're the bridge, and you're trying to ensure that both internal audience understands what's going on, why it's important, why they need to take it on board, and externally why whatever your sector, company, organisation is trying to do and achieve actually is good, adds value, whether it's commercially or to society, hopefully both. So
Hopefully.
yeah, so I don't think it's never been as important as it is today, and that variety of stakeholders is becoming more diverse and more engaged. And I think, especially at community level, that communities understand that they have power, and that if they organise themselves in some way, they can have real influence over companies. So it's important that organisations, companies, sectors are able to engage in a meaningful way and facilitate that conversation. Because if there's misunderstanding, the enemy of public affairs in many ways is perception, because perception lags reality in most cases and is often misinformed.
The perception thing is something I want to pick up on. It's really interesting. Before I kind of ask you a direct question on that, when you were talking about the personalisation of a handheld letter and the point about how things come full circle, it's really interesting. Now, rightly or wrongly, the image I've got in my head is Keir Starmer sat next to Donald Trump in the White House. They're both wearing the same suit, and Keir Starmer's got a letter from the King. And, there's an argument here, well, it's all done for PR and it looks good and everything. But I do think there is some, obviously, if you get a letter from the King, I imagine it's quite nice, but there is some weight and some value in that level of personification. And that's just what came to mind when you were talking there.
Yeah, I think that's right. And it extends beyond, the letter is like almost a trivial example in some ways, but you're absolutely right. The fact that Starmer pulled it out of his pocket and handed it to President Trump, it's like, that was a moment and it meant something. But that can apply more broadly. I've found increasingly that senior ministers and senior officials really value talking to the people who actually run companies and can make decisions, or specialists in their particular areas, to get real insight and real understanding. And facilitating that dialogue is really important. And it's just the equivalent of the personal signed letter. If they're talking to the CEO of the company, they know they're talking to someone who makes the decisions and can influence how things turn out. It's a similar sort of thing. It's also probably one of the biggest challenges because there are just so many people out there who all want a piece of the talking to the right minister or the right civil servant, or the right SPAD. So it's a competition. So, one of the skills of public affairs is positioning yourself to be the right people to speak to about whatever your sector is, whatever your specialism is, and that you're trusted. And I think the currency for public affairs is trust.
That's really interesting. There's many things for me to pick up on what you said and potentially come back to. In terms of the external stakeholder, if we focus on those for a couple of moments, the way that communication and tech has changed from letters to text messages to WhatsApps to whatever it might be, we focus a lot on public affairs as a profession. I'm really interested in understanding your perspective on how do you think that these professional external stakeholders are going to have to adapt or are planning to adapt with the new tech in the next 2, 3, 4, 5 years? Because I can imagine if you're a civil servant, if you're an MP, if you're a minister, as you said, you don't have a lot of time, but you do really need the valuable insight from industry. Do you have a view at all on how these external stakeholders are potentially going to adapt their working practices moving forward?
One thing that's absolutely for sure, and this is not a unique insight, but it's important, is that the development of mass communications like WhatsApp, like TikTok, like emails, the whole social media means that everybody who's got an opinion or a question can get it out there. And that makes it difficult for companies or sectors to understand what is being said about them and where it's being said and who's saying it and who are they saying it to and are they having an impact or an influence. If a local activist is pumping out multiple times a day, but they've only got 10 followers, it's not really going to have a massive influence on either the local politicians, whether that's the local councillor or county council or whatever level, or the mayor or or the MP. But if they start to get some traction and that 10 becomes 100 or 1,000, then suddenly they are people that you need to try to engage with and understand why they're saying and doing what they're doing. People have understood in communities that they can generate action, they can generate a response, they can have an influence if they get that bit right. And I can only see that increasing as we go forward. One of the things that I think is, as we all know, is, is it true? Is it fake? It sort of, in a way, doesn't matter if people are talking about it. What you need to do is try and understand why, and then try to influence the way that goes. Because if it is not true, if it is in the parlance of fake news, then it can have real impacts and can do real damage. So for external communications teams, for public affairs professionals, for those who engage in social impact type activities with their neighbours and communities, these things are a daily challenge. When I was overseeing communications, I also used to say to the guys in the teams, this is 24/7, 365. There is no day that you're off. We had some activists, I won't pinpoint it, but some activists in Germany firebombed one of our places on the 27th of December a couple of years ago. And the fact that they chose that gap when everything was closed, when nearly everybody was off, one, gave them the opportunity, but two, it made it more difficult to be able to respond. But it's really hugely important that you do respond. And that whole thing recently with the fire at Heathrow where the boss was in bed and had his phone switched off.
Yeah.
Or, the famous BP incident a few years back. If you're the leader of a company, you can't afford not to be available and ready to react and respond when things become very serious. And there's a scale, obviously, for how you ramp that up. But I think all those messages have landed with activists, and everybody really is enabled to become an activist these days simply because of the social media that is available to them and the traction that it can gain.
Really good. Really, really interesting. I want to go back to a couple of things you said earlier, and you said them separately, but I think we can kind of potentially draw them into the same next point of conversation. Talked around how public affairs, a lot of it is about perception. And you talked about how half the job is for an internal audience and half the job is an external audience. And you also talked about the value in connecting leaders of businesses or real specialists of businesses with decision makers. Now, in my mind, given the landscape that we're all going to live and work in the next 5 years, I perceive the value of public affairs to increase if you can do that well. But let me sense check that with you. Is that how you see it? And also, for those people listening to this podcast that maybe have a challenge when it comes to an internal audience or internal stakeholders and the value of what their function does, do you have any thoughts on not only what they can do now, but what they can potentially do in the coming years?
Sure. Of course, I've got a vested interest in saying that public affairs is important and adds value.
Naturally.
That's why we're here, Jack. But I really do, because I think that, as I said, if you tend to ignore it or pay less attention to what's happening outside of your company or your sector, then something will happen that's going to trip you up, have an impact, and usually an impact means money and people. And if you're not paying attention to that, or you don't have a team whose job it is to pay attention to that and to keep you informed and to produce the response or the reaction from the company, at least having a narrative to position yourself and explain yourself, then again, I think you're going to be in trouble. And as I said, I think the currency of public affairs is trust. And by having a constant dialogue, all the different levels we talked about, from the very local neighbourhood all the way up to Secretary of State level, developing and enhancing your trust amongst all of those external stakeholders lessens, doesn't completely remove, but lessens the likelihood that you're going to have a problem. However, the really important is that when something happens, and at some point something will, because you've developed those relationships, you're not having to try and find out who to speak to. And when you do respond, because you've built up trust, you are believed. It's not fake news to those audiences. And I think that's hugely important. So investing over the long term in developing all those relationships, I think actually, one, it helps guide how things evolve in, let's say, a structured form, like as policy evolves and discussions are taking place about new policies or new directions for sectors. But two, when something, really does happen is a huge bump in the road, then you're enabled to try and start to address it much more quickly and with a degree of belief in what you're trying to do and why you're trying to do it that particular way. So I know it's all a bit theoretical, but I really believe that, and I've seen it happen many times.
Let's shift ever so slightly and talk about AI and talk about tech. And obviously, with someone with vast experience, you've seen and articulated quite well how the profession has changed. What are your thoughts on the impact that AI is going to have on public affairs as a profession?
Okay, so I'm quite long in the tooth, Jack, these days, having been around. So when I started, I used to get the daily, from a Westminster perspective rather than Brussels, but I used to get the daily bundle of Hansard. I used to go through it myself. Then I discovered things like monitoring companies. And they've evolved as well, and they use their techniques involving artificial intelligence now, I suspect, to ensure that they gather all the information that is needed. So as those basic tools have evolved, the sources of information have become broader, more accessible, deeper, and like any walk of life, the available information is too much. So you need to be able to break that down into usable size pieces and focused. And that's where I think technology has evolved and is evolving and can really help people in areas like public affairs, because the amount of material that's coming out, whether it's from government, NGOs, from academics, from community groups, is ever growing. So being able to keep an eye on all of that, monitor it properly and effectively, and understand what really is going on, AI certainly can help with that. In particular, when governments do a huge document dump on a particular policy area, like all the papers that came out just a few weeks ago from now when on industrial strategy. In the past, you'd have had the hard copies and you'd have been flicking through them and you'd be trying to understand. Now you can just instruct AI to go through that and pull all the stuff that's relevant to you out of them, and exceptionally quickly, and you're ahead straight away. But the expectation is that you've already done that. So whereas in the past you could say, give me a couple of days, let me go through all the documents, I'll come back to you. People are on the phone or on an email straight away or on the WhatsApp saying, so what does this mean for us? Is there anything in there that we need to be aware of? So the expectation has increased as the technology and its utility for public affairs professionals has increased. I guess the real question is, where's that going, or what's it mean for public affairs?
Well, yeah, I think that is the question. I think there is a broad acceptance that tech it's not just coming, it's here, and the profession is going to have to engage with it and hopefully walk towards it. It's really interesting to hear you're saying about the accuracy and the focused information. Let's envisage in 6 months, in a year's time, if you're getting more accurate information than let's say you're getting now, and that's only going to increase, what do you think that means for you as an individual, but also other peers out there?
I think one of the things that was what I just mentioned is that you are expected to know much more quickly, interpret it, translate it to what it means to your company or sector or whatever, and be able to provide the CEO or the board members straight away with an explanation, to already be working on the narrative that is needed, to be understanding who you need to talk to, if it's gone your way or hasn't. You need to understand the implications. So all that for sure. I do think, though, that one thing that is hugely important and we in public affairs need to keep in mind is the potential impact on how democracy operates and the role of politicians within that, in that that's a human relationship. So no matter how much information is out there and how quickly it can be processed and how quickly it can be transmitted, it's the response and the relation to politicians and the people they represent and those who work and generate income and wealth in their constituencies. That's the type of relationship that matters. And I genuinely wonder how that is going to be impacted or potentially changed by increasing use of AI and AI tools into public affairs. So for information understanding, fantastic. It's never been better. How that then impacts the way we interact with people, I think, is perhaps the challenge and the more interesting area, because, of course, you're no longer the only ones who have the access to that information. In the past, information was quite contained and you had to talk to someone who had access to it, but now it's much more broadly available. So those you're talking to have probably got access to much of the information that you have, maybe not all, but a fair degree of it. And how they respond to that is really important. That then comes down to people and relationships and how they relate to each other and how they can speak and continue to speak to each other, because I think that's what matters. And we need to keep in mind, I think, where the ultimate decision making is. You will hear a lot of scare stories about AI. I think as long as the decision making, the understanding of the decision making of what it means stays with people, then in terms of that relationship between constituents, companies, policymakers and politicians, is going to be enhanced but not replaced. I think you need to worry if the decision making is being based on an interpretive AI generated answer rather than something that's been done by a human.
It's really interesting because if I kind of summarise what I think I've heard, or in layman's terms, which is pretty much the only way I operate, it feels like the availability of information for public affairs is going to help them when it comes to the internal audience, pushing value back to internal stakeholders, telling people the implications of things for their business. But when I look at the external audience, it feels like the key still is relationships. You can have all the information, and arguably the information now is more easily accessible, but actually how decisions are made still, in theory, in my mind, looks like it's going to be done people to people. It's a people kind of environment, and logic would suggest that if you get a bit more time back because your information is quicker and more accurate, you can then, in theory, spend the time with the external stakeholder.
Yeah, the time thing's an interesting one because all of these things are, in theory, designed to save time in one way or another, save having to spend hours and hours trying to find something out and it's instantaneous. But I never found that I'd got more time to do. Maybe I was spending more time engaging in the conversations. But you're right, as long as it remains at that human level, those conversations and decisions are done by people. What I worry about, and I'm not the only one, is that we still have the capacity to sense check anything that's coming out of the technology. And I know it's evolving at a pace which is unbelievable. But the times I've used it, sometimes it has been absolutely brilliant. And other times I've looked at the output and gone, oh, that's just rubbish.
Going to be interesting, isn't it?
But you need to be able to understand and recognize that. And if you take people out of the process, then those who can understand and recognize that it either is good stuff or bad stuff, just being black and white here. I mean, I know it's a hugely difficult area to try and put into a black and white scenario, but as long as you have people who can understand it and sense check and value check, then that's great. But if you reduce the number of people who have the ability, the understanding, the experience to be able to look at an output and say, yeah, that's pretty spot on, or actually that's wide of the mark. If there aren't enough people who really do that, then that's when I worry that decisions will start to be made based on output from AI, or decisions will be made by AI rather than by people.
Yeah, that's the danger. In terms of what the next 2 years, 5 years, even longer than that looks like for the profession, do you have any other additional thoughts or comments at all on what the future could be?
I think when we spoke about this a little earlier in the conversation, Jack, the thing is that nothing is predictable anymore. So the one thing that is predictable is the fact that it's unpredictable. Who knows? That old adage, a week's a long time in politics. Well, a day's a long time in politics at the moment. So never mind what 4 or 5 years. I mean, what's going to be the situation by the time it comes to the next general election in the UK? Who knows? I suspect, because we're going to have the Scottish parliamentary elections, the Senate elections in Wales, could have a huge impact on outcome and the direction of politics in this country. You're seeing at the European level significant changes at the Brussels end. I mean, the fact that there was a vote of confidence just last week in von der Leyen, it's something which is quite an unusual step, but it's not going to go away. Those challenges to the governing group, whether it's the Prime Minister, whether it's the President of the EU, whoever, those challenges are going to come quicker and quicker. And I think we've seen that in the pace of politics, the churn, the turnover. So the only thing that, to me, that's predictable is the unpredictability. But that doesn't help. Especially,
no, it doesn't.
Especially when you're trying to base your decisions as companies, about investments in either people or technology or infrastructure that you need to support your business is really difficult. I think one of the things we can seek to aim for is more stability compared to other areas. So I think at the moment you would be fair in assessing that UK or Europe is perhaps more stable than the US, but for how long will that stay the case? What happens, we've clearly seen that an activist president can have huge influence absolutely everywhere, create wave after wave of uncertainty. How you respond to that is hugely important. And I think one of the, irrespective of the domestic agenda and how things have evolved for the current government, I think the one thing lots of commentators and people would say is that he's handled that evolving dynamic of what President Trump has done and the impact he's had on the world stage better than most. And that has hopefully helped to give a little bit more stability to what's happening here in the UK from an international perspective, from an external investor perspective, perhaps not at a domestic perspective. That's a different thing. And what I can say is that for sure, public affairs professionals trying to understand how those external dynamics and those internal evolution of domestic politics interact is going to become an increasing skill. And that when I started doing this, geopolitical understanding was not really part of the requirement for someone doing public affairs. Now, absolutely a core element, whether it's in Europe, the US, Middle East.
It's not going to change, is it?
It's not going to change. So, yeah, sorry. The only thing that's going to be predictable is unpredictability.
Yeah, the known unknowns.
Yeah, exactly. To quote somebody.
Yeah. Okay, Martin, thank you. A couple of questions to finish. The first question is, what is your one singular non-negotiable advice or bit of insight you would give to someone that's starting out their career in public affairs right now?
That's a very tricky question. I'd say work on the trust, because actually, as I've said a number of times, actually, that is your currency. And it's not something that can be taught. It's something that you develop a skill in. And good public affairs professionals develop that technique of being able to talk to the whole spectrum of politicians, policy influencers, other stakeholders, with that aim of building trust in that relationship. So I'd say you need to really understand what you're representing in depth and detail and be able to translate that into a message that can be understood by those external audiences. That is the core thing that public affairs is trying to do. Develop your trust-building skills.
Second one, what is your best or favourite party conference story or memory?
Okay. Being a little scurrilous about that, Jack. Thanks for the question. Probably the memory one is the most difficult because I probably enjoyed some of those conferences a little bit too much. When you're still in the main bar, main hotel bar, where the conference is being held in the early hours of the morning, your memory's not the best, but you had a good time. The thing about party conferences that's changed and has really saddened me is they've become too slick. And in the past, it was the time when you could speak to ministers or shadow ministers quite openly. You could have, a coffee with them or a glass of wine or a beer or whatever, and you could have a really good chat. And now, the more senior they are, the quicker they're in a room, say what they've come to say, offer scripts, and they're out of the room. And the opportunity for having that engagement has gone. So I'd say my best times were probably a little while ago when those politicians would stay in the room and have a chat with you, and you knew them beyond just talking about policy and politics, who actually knew them as people. That's really difficult these days.
Very interesting. Next question. Who's your favourite Prime Minister?
My favourite Prime Minister. Oh, gosh. You know that when I started off after postgrad work, I was a political historian.
I didn't know that.
And I specialised in the early 19th century. So I'm going to go back and say somebody who really changed society from the early 19th century, and it's still recognisable today, Sir Robert Peel, because it's just too contentious. Here's the thing about public affairs, Jack, that I should have said to your question about the one thing, is I know there are quite a few people who practice public affairs who wear their party allegiance on their sleeve. And my advice would be, no, you've got to get on with the whole spectrum and try to have that two-way relationship. So it doesn't matter what my personal politics are. I'm not there to represent me. I'm there to represent my company, my sector, my NGO, whatever it may be. And you need to do what's in their interests. So, yeah, I'm on safe ground by going back to someone like Sir Robert Peel, because if I picked Thatcher or Blair or Cameron, people go, what?
Well, absolutely. And then the final question is, who's the best Prime Minister that the UK's never had?
Interesting. So I did write some academic work on this. And at the time, I chose David Owen for the reason that I thought that he'd been in the wrong party twice. First the Labour Party and then the SDP, whereas I thought that actually an awful lot of his instincts were, let's say, on the left-hand side of the Conservative Party, and that his journey meant that he missed becoming Prime Minister, because I think he probably would have been a thoughtful and good one. And folks, if you can check it online, you can find an article I wrote about that many years ago.
I'll definitely be doing that at some point today once we finish recording. So, Martin, thank you. That's been really, really good. Thank you for joining us on the podcast. And my thanks, of course, to our in-house producer, Ollie Foster. Perhaps you have a view on what the future of public affairs looks like and you'd like to share it with us, or perhaps you'd like to get in touch about something you've heard on the discussion today. Please follow the link in the show's bio, which will direct you to our feedback page for Helio Intelligence, which is the home of de Havilland and Forefront.